Dear colleagues, guests, and organizers of the conference, I feel very honored to give a talk to you today on a topic that seems so resonant with the mission of the event. I will propose a research framework and share outcomes of my own study by way of congratulating the Synesthesia Society of Africa on its inception and inaugural conference. My own experience of working towards similar goals here in Russia has never been easy, but our contribution to human diversity, scientific advancement, and individual well-being should never be underestimated. I wish the SSOA to successfully navigate through the teething problems so that we could shortly establish communication and research partnership in truly cross-cultural projects, so essential for congenital synesthesia. Indeed, some anecdotal evidence and scientific data demonstrate that congenital synesthesia is embedded in culture, its concepts and practices. Atypical brain development has long been a suspect in congenital synesthesia, especially with a high synesthesia quotient. But increasing evidence indicates that well beyond this biological explication, multiple circumstances and consequences of the individual's development may be the other, equally important part of the story. For example, to identify some synesthetic stimulus or inducer as having the flavor of borscht, a beetroot meat soup in the Slavic national cuisines, you need to share the relevant background. You evoke a conundrum of cultural meanings if you report that Westminster tastes like after 8 mints. By reconstructing their experiences, Solomon Shereshevsky and James Wannerton have implicitly testified that mechanisms responsible for synesthesia to some extent get shaped by cultural and social factors. Vladimir Nabokov's alphabets of Russian, French, English, and German show how synesthetic perceptions are ingrained in the culture-specific practice of literacy, and how, on the other hand, these concurrents can be modified by the subtle nuances of speech production physicality. Synesthesia spans cognitive domains such as letters and phonemes, music and spaces, pain and empathy and chess. We all know from some studies that synesthesia's elicitation can be sensitive to meaning and context, and its inducers can be transferable, and they can be as exotic and rare as finger counting, dice patterns, and swimming styles. In 2009, I conducted an experiment regarding colored days of the week. I introduced synesthete test subjects to an additional 8th day of the week that I called Just Day. For this, I recruited only those synesthetes who have colored days of the week, and grapheme and phoneme-based varieties were discarded. These were several tasks around this Just Day. The participants read a science fiction short story. As an illustration, I provided them with a calendar, the weeks in which contained 8 days instead of 7, with Just Day conveniently placed between Thursday and Friday. In this new calendrical system, my test subjects were to calculate the days of some events, such as holidays and birthdays. In about 30 minutes, as a result of completing the recategorization experiment, 8 test subjects displayed new, unexpected, emergent colors for this Just Day. These propensities imply that synesthesia has certain cognitive regularities and plasticity, which get modified through exposure to a socially regulated practice in meaningful interaction with a distinct environment. For synesthesia, it does not matter how many days are there in the week and how many letters are there in your alphabet. The categories and systems of time concept and verbal symbolization are more important. After Ian Watson's claim about congenital synesthesia in 1997, its research should have taken a sudden swirl. Watson put it very simple. Watson's ideas are reinforced by another anthropologist, Sean Day, whose book Synesthesia includes lots of real-life examples of and ideas about cross-cultural equivalents of synesthesia inducers. In 2009, Asifa Majid and her team designed a pilot manual for researching synesthesia in non-Western contexts. Nicholas Root's team asks, does the color of your letter depend on your language, and reveal regulatory factors that determine synesthetic experience in 7 different languages. My own project was initially motivated by some researchers' arguments against psychological uniformity of the human mind, theories of cross-cultural psychological variations, the cultural historical theory of higher cognitive development, and anthropology of the senses. Anthropology of congenital synesthesia attempts to integrate the cognitive domains of ethnography, social and cognitive psychology, and neuroscience. The key papers and talks seem to be done on these issues between 2008 and 2010, but it is only recently that anthropology has re-engaged with congenital synesthesia, as evidenced by the 2 sessions held at a conference this May by Concordia University's Center for Sensory Studies. Genetic studies demonstrated that synesthesia is a heritable trait. In humans, estimation of heritability has been applied to establish, just as one example here, that substantial variation in risk for many disorders like schizophrenia or autism, as well as for some cognitive traits, such as the level of IQ, is genetic in origin. A linear statistical approach puts this variance of trait expression on range from obligate to reactive. For synesthesia, several genes may be responsible for cognitive sensory transduction. Therefore, in order to identify the specific mechanisms of multifactorial gene expression and their facultative calibration over development, we need to know what these cultural circumstances of the development are, and more specifically, what these development circumstances mean for potentially synesthetic brains. Perhaps the first insight that such an anthropological framework provides us with is a functional universality among the systems of inducers in distinct synesthesia types. Indeed, what do spatial sequence, mirror touch, and grapheme color types have in common? Are these all different conditions? Watson divides congenital synesthesia into major and common types. Similarly, Day talks about sensory and cognitive types, and Majid's team differentiates synesthesia proper and congenital synesthesia. We dare to state that at some functional level there is no distinction between these varieties. Yes, they can overlap in the same case or be attributed to the same genetic markers, but without a cultural analysis, this can be yet another puzzle. To start with, let us remember that language and music has long been attributed to some common basic aspects. Both have temporal structures, both are means of establishing emotional bonds, and essentially both are social conventions. In the brain, both language and music are processed in Broca's area. As to mirror touch, to draw on the critique of the mirror neurons, imitation is based on inductive generalizations, and such generalizations are always based on intersubjective interaction, that is, culture. Distinct elements in the noise substrate that a sound-based synesthete is not purely biological too. To be discernible, noise needs to undergo the culture-embedded processes of differentiation and unitization. Therefore, for synesthesia, the system of mirror touch is no different from the meaningfulness of language, or math, or music. For a mirror touch synesthete, body is language and body is music. It seems that for congenital synesthesia to take root in neurocognitive processes and for its genetic to be expressed, it needs a system of generalizable and recombinable units that humans develop and culturally transmit for mediating meaning making, whether it be social, numerical, or gustatory recognition, verbal or sound symbolization, olfactory or corporeal perceptualities. In other words, synesthesia types are domain-specific instantiations, while as a genus, synesthesia is a phenomenon with common domain general functionality. On par with high or low synesthesia quotient, such an understanding may give us a second chance to identify the evasive brain differences and genetic endowments in synesthetes as a response to the recent challenges posed by Simon Fisher and Amanda Tillet's genetic investigation and Jean-Michel Huppé's neurophysiological research. This is not generalization for its own sake. Neuroscientific studies have shown that synesthesia is associated with faster reaction times, larger activation in specific brain regions, and earlier, more effective skill acquisition. The cognitive skills that host synesthesia seem to deal with special systems, such as reading, music, and others. Learning them is different from explicit language because what is important is not what these systems are, but the way they are. Based on appropriation into perception through developing expertise, these skills deal with semiotic systems and become perception-like capabilities for interacting with the world. Moreover, experience with a category may be sufficient to explain the typologically clustered neuronal activity relevant for synesthesia. Here, for its instantiations in the brain, synesthesia can depend on multiple but identifiable variables, such as the age of skill acquisition, in its critical periods, obtained level of expertise, methods of assistance or scaffolding, and so on, as embedded in culture-sensitive practices. Here is a big question that has been debated recently. Why color, and why not only color, as the most prevalent manifestation of synesthetic concurrence? Color, as we know it, is not a 100% natural thing, as well as any other sensory modality. Anthropology of the senses has produced an abundance of evidence of how active this or that mode of modality can be in particular cultures. What if a culture has already multiple color associations with a particular trigger system? If the workload of chromatic vision is already quite intense, color might be an unlikely candidate for synesthetic concurrence. So the host modality, whether it be color, location, empathic projections, may also be an opportune or negotiable domain for synesthesia. What's more, upon scrutiny, not all color concurrents are just colors. They can include localization, depth, volume, movement, texture, and other non-veridical qualities. Nabokov explained that some of his synesthetic colors need to be thoroughly savored in the mouth in order to reveal more tangibly. Culture and social influence can modify this additional unmediated experience through referential standards. Take, for instance, the Mohawk color terms. These qualities may get lost in translation. Moreover, introspecting, identifying, and understanding synesthesia can be a specific example of culture-dependent categorization and related ways of sharing. As Sean Day explained it from his own experience, synesthetes have to negotiate simultaneous and most likely conflicting cross-modal association alongside their own synesthetic perceptions. This sensorial negotiation is as much biological as it is social. To structure an anthropological perspective, we first branched out into at least 3 levels of analysis, at the points that are critical for interference of cultural determinants through exposure and learning. First, culture and synesthesia formation. Second, culture and synesthesia identification. And third, culture and synesthesia integration or rejection. This will encourage us to contemplate these big questions. In other words, is synesthesia a cultural universal? How does culture contribute to the development of synesthesia? And how does culture influence the prevalence of specific types of synesthesia? How much does culture contribute to cases with different synesthesia quotients? Therefore, culture-related determinants may not be limited to the domain of perceptual and cognitive formations. My survey among Russian synesthetes demonstrates that, like their North American and European counterparts, the most frequent variety of synesthesia is also the grapheme type, but the second most frequent type is the one based on music. Colored days of the week comes fourth, not second. Surprisingly, colored personalities are in the fifth place, not 10th, with colored names coming sixth. This can be explained by a lot of reasons, one of which being that the early musical exposure is much more common here than early instruction in calendar, and human relations can be cognitively more challenging. Apparently, prevalence of synesthesia types can also depend on genetic predispositions for domain-specific instantiations. Anyway, because of their more specific application, modality dependence or independence, these specific instantiations can also be adaptively embedded in cultural practices. Social integration of congenital synesthesia has reciprocal connections with its development and application. And here is one example. Olfactory synesthesias can be contemplated through questions such as why, unlike interactions between other practices and synesthesia types, there are so many more synesthete perfumers compared to the synesthetic chefs, and how congenital synesthesia actually teaches and enriches the Western sensorium. Linda Bartoshuk, an American researcher of the chemical senses, said that smell is the only sense for which we can create a new stimulus that's never been on the surface of Earth, and we can perceive it, which makes the domain of olfaction an ever-expanding practice with unconstrained creative imagery. Through creative practices that address synesthesia and mimics its imagery, industrial perfumery recruits synesthetes and draw on their synesthesia. Worthy of note here is that having congenital synesthesia can drastically affect the olfactory system and olfactory cognition. In this way, olfactory experience in synesthete perfumers makes a leap from being dormant or interpreted as Martian smells to providing knowledge about this generative experience valuable for perfumery and olfactory science and art. While pertaining to the same principles, we can have not only cross-cultural comparative insights. And foreign but relevant to our answering the questions, what is it like to be a synesthete in a different culture, can be the social norms, intersubjective expectations, and introspective references of the historical periods when Georg Sachs or Solomon Chereshevsky, for example, lived. Congenital synesthesia can be studied within a professional subculture, such as the perfumery world, high cuisine, or medicine and its potentialities for a doctor with Miro touch. If we are to know what it is like to be synesthetes in different cultures, we need to take into account the roles of technologies, tools of the mind, educational methods, and spontaneous way of acquiring language, music, and math through delineating brain-environment interactions. Synesthetes themselves form networking groups around sharing knowledge, organizing public events, and enhancing self-awareness. They call themselves Synes, develop their own jargon, have in-jokes, and thus they construct a culture of their own. When the Russian Synesthesia community began taking shape back in 2008, it was expected that to follow in the footsteps of our older counterparts in America and Britain, we would also become an NGO. But social reality proved us wrong. Unlike somewhere else, NGOs in Russia are less about social recognition and human rights, but more about belonging to governmental institutions. Just like in Europe and US, an NGO is a political claim, but politics here is constructed as a claim for power and control, not much as an attempt to improve people's well-being. So, the Russian group of synesthetes is now a community in its full-blooded meaning, with relationships and common projects, but we still abstain from having a wider outlook. This gradually negotiated status is also a result of an impact on what synesthetes in Russia expect of themselves, or circumstances and societal functions around it. There was this case from my experience in studying the condition. It was a brief but quite striking report when a young lady with synesthesia told me that she had synesthesia to everything. After several questions, it turned out that everything was just all words and the inner verbalizing, thinking in words. Our gold standards of verifying congenital synesthesia, consistency, involuntariness, and others can or cannot be comprehensible across cultures, which send us full circle back down the anthropological path. Research evidence unequivocally demonstrates that environment and culture have a remarkable impact on key aspects of congenital synesthesia. So it is important to study the specific regularities in how social factors influence the expression of synesthesia and how, through their effects, synesthesia is typologically instantiated, subjectively perceived, objectively identified, collectively understood, practically applied, and purposefully developed or concealed. Such issues place synesthesia at the very core of anthropological concerns, because these variations are results of complex interaction between culture and biology, when practice imbues physiological potentials for novel emergent formations. Further work in this area will improve our understanding of synesthesia and factors that modify perceptual, affective, and behavioral concerns of synesthesia. It will help synchronize multidisciplinary research and consequently improve its benefits for synesthetes, society, and science. My talk has reviewed potentially illuminating perspectives on synesthesia, from cross-cultural and historical to personal, professional, and subcultural. We are yet to obtain scientific evidence whether congenital synesthesia exists worldwide and spreads across geographical and cultural boundaries. We can change this situation by collaborating with local communities and experts, and together do research on synesthesia with the aim of comparing data from Western and non-Western cultures. I'm optimistic here, because new perspectives come about only through recognizing new constraints. But when recognized and welcomed, these new constraints prove meaningful and insightful. Thank you.